Good evening. I'm glad that you could join us for this week's edition of Sunday Interview. My name is Grevazo Zulu, standing in for Franklin Tembo Jr., who has temporarily been assigned to handle the Zone 6 games and the AFCON. Arguably the biggest story of the week that has just ended has been the re-election of Barack Obama as President of the United States of America for a second term in office. President Obama won his first term in office on a promise of change and hope. But his first 4 years in office faced challenges that included the worst recession since the Depression in the 1930s. He also faced wars and the Arab Spring, which saw some long-time leaders like Hosni Mubarak fall from grace. And we also had Libyan leader Muammar Gaddafi also fall from grace. Will Obama's second term in office be different? These are the questions that we're supposed to answer today. What lessons can Africa and Zambia in particular draw from the US elections? Will President Obama give more attention to Africa in his last term in office? In the studio this evening, I have United States of America Ambassador to Zambia, Mark Storella. Your Excellency, welcome to the interview.
Grevazo, thank you so much. Glad to be here.
I'm glad that you made it.
Thank you.
Well, before we go into discussing today's topic, we captured the jubilation and the speeches that followed soon after the elections. Let's look at this clip.
I want to thank every American who participated in this election. Whether you held an Obama sign or a Romney sign, you made your voice heard, and you made a difference. I just spoke with Governor Romney, and I congratulated him and Paul Ryan on a hard-fought campaign. I want to thank my friend and partner of the last 4 years, America's happy warrior, the best vice president anybody could ever hope for, Joe Biden. A long campaign is now over. And whether I earned your vote or not, I have listened to you. I have learned from you. And you've made me a better president. And with your stories and your struggles, I return to the White House more determined and more inspired than ever about the work there is to do and the future that lies ahead. Tonight, you voted for action, not politics as usual. You elected us to focus on your jobs, not ours. And in the coming weeks and months, I am looking forward to reaching out and working with leaders of both parties to meet the challenges we can only solve together. Reducing our deficit, reforming our tax code, fixing our immigration system, freeing ourselves from foreign oil. We've got more work to do. But that doesn't mean your work is done. The role of citizen in our democracy does not end with your vote. America's never been about what can be done for us. It's about what can be done by us together through the hard and frustrating but necessary work of self-government. That's the principle we were founded on.
A very close race. Would you want to explain what exactly happened in this election?
Sure. I think it's very important to understand that in this election, like your elections, just like Zambian elections, this was a tripartite election. And we had an election not only for the president, we focus on that a lot, but also for our Congress, which means the Senate and the House of Representatives. And you know, there were elections at local levels too, governors, mayors, and other things. But what we saw in many respects is continuity. President Obama retains the White House. In the Senate, the Democrats remain in the Senate. They've picked up a couple of seats there. In the House of Representatives, the Republicans have a majority still, even though the Democrats picked up a few seats. So what I would say is that in many respects, this election was a pretty close election, although fairly decisive. In the end, President Obama had over 300 electoral votes compared with just about 200 electoral votes for Mitt Romney. So the way our system works, it really wasn't all that close. I think President Obama can feel very good about his electoral victory. But I think one of the clear messages that came out of this is that what we just saw President Obama saying, the American people want to see their government get things done. They want to see the two parties work together and produce results. Campaigning is not the same thing as governance. They take different skills in some respects. Different things have to be emphasized. Now they're going to have to get down to the hard work of finding ways to work together to solve the problems of the American people.
There was so much talk about the Electoral College. Would you want to talk to that and tell us why has the Americans decided to choose this kind of system?
Well, let me start by saying that even for most Americans, the Electoral College is not that easy to understand. But basically, it's important to remember this was designed in our Constitution over 200 years ago. So if we were doing it today, we might do it differently. I'm not sure. But it was designed then at a time when the states had much more power relative to the federal government than they do today. And the Electoral College was designed in a way to make the states present their votes together as a state, as opposed to each individual person. And the other thing about the Electoral College is that the way it works is if you win a state, you get all the electoral votes. So if you win California by one vote, you get over 50 electoral votes all at once, even if you won by just one vote. That tends to magnify the result of the election. It usually means that we don't have something that looks like a tie. So it's actually a good way of giving a clear result. In this election, President Obama won many states by just a couple of points. But because he won them by a couple of points, he won the whole state's electoral votes. So it gives a much more clear outcome. And that's one of the reasons, I think, which I think is a very positive thing, that Governor Romney conceded defeat only a few hours after the polls closed in California.
Well, it's been the case. McCain did the same. So.
Well, as you know, back in 2000, that didn't happen. It was very close, and it took a couple of weeks, several weeks before it was decided back in 2000. But here, we knew the result very quickly because of the Electoral College, and the Republican challenger conceded defeat very quickly, which is very good, I think, for the United States. It gives you clarity right away.
Now, maybe you want to explain how will Obama maneuver to ensure his policies are implemented, because it looks like the status quo has been maintained, like you earlier said. Senate, yes, the Democrats have taken it, but the House still remains deeply partisan.
Well, this will be the art of governing. It's going to require a lot of work, no doubt. I would emphasize in this, the American people, though, had a lot of time to see what the positions of the two parties were. And I think President Obama can come out of this feeling that many of the elements of his policy that are especially presidential, including foreign policy, are vindicated. I think the president can feel very strongly that his decision to end the war in Iraq was approved of by the American people. I think his decision to set a timetable to get us out of Afghanistan and that war as well is something the American people want. So on some of the things that are especially foreign policy, I think he can feel very strongly he has strong support from the American people. Domestic policy will be harder. I hope we'll talk more about that.
Now, let's look at one of the other highlights of this election. It's been described as the most expensive election ever in the U.S. $6 billion spent. Did the rich hijack the polls?
Well, there's a simple answer to that, which is no. And the reason I say that is because tremendous amounts of money poured into the campaign, especially at the end. And a lot of the stories over the last several days have been Republican contributors calling up the Republican leadership and saying, what did you do with our money? Why didn't we win if we spent all that money? I actually think that most of that money is spent on advertisements, usually TV advertisements, and probably those are not as effective as people think, especially when you have the phenomenon of the debates. The debates were a big, big part of this election. The American people had the opportunity to see the candidates very, very clearly. In many cases in these debates, normal people got to pose questions to President Obama and to Mitt Romney directly. So I think the debates in many ways cleared the field from all that money and made the money less important.
Yeah, but if people are going to spend, we most likely are going to see this from the actions of the Congress and probably the President himself.
I'm not sure what to expect, and I think we're really going to have to look. But this was the most expensive campaign ever, and $6 billion is an awful lot of money.
Which means a dollar for all of us in the world.
A dollar for each person in the world. That's right. So it's an awful lot of money. I'd like to say that we had many more advertisements than anyone ever had in a Zambian election, but you had more chitenges than we had. So.
But they didn't reach $6 billion.
No, it didn't. But what I mean, though, by that is that obviously candidates think and want to believe that spending money to try to influence the electorate will help them. What I think this election showed to a lot of the people in the United States who put that money up is that money doesn't buy an election, that the people still make up their own minds.
Would you say this is a time to revisit the law on limiting funding and spending in an election?
You know, our law changed because of an interpretation of the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court in our country, as it does here, interprets the laws and says what's constitutional and what's not constitutional. And they changed an interpretation that made it possible for individuals and businesses to give much larger amounts of money. I think a debate is now going to go on as to whether or not that was a good idea. And it's possible that Congress will pass a different law to try to change the influence of money in our elections.
Yeah, well, let's get now back to Africa. What can Africa and Zambia learn from this election in the States?
Could I say one thing right away about what anyone can learn from this, and especially what Zambia can learn? The United States and Zambia are both democracies. In many respects, I feel like we are partners and we're in this together. The United States has long been a leader in democracy on the world stage, but Zambia is really a leader in democracy here in Africa. I think many Zambians don't realize this, but do you know how many countries in the SADC region have twice changed the party in power through peaceful democratic elections? How many would you think?
Zambia probably is leading.
The answer is one, Zambia. Zambia is the only country that's done it. You're the leaders. And I think that democracy is not a perfect system. I like to quote Winston Churchill. Winston Churchill said that democracy is the worst form of government, except all the others. And that means we have to keep learning. We can learn from one another. I think that the United States can learn from Zambia's elections. You had tremendous involvement of young people. And we have had that too, I think, but I think we can learn from Zambia. You got a lot of people registered, young people registered to vote. I think that's a really good thing. In both cases, the United States and Zambia, in both our elections, they weren't contested in the end. And when it was over, in both cases, the party that lost conceded defeat and accepted the will of the people. That's a great lesson for the whole world. In terms of what Zambia might be able to learn that's different, Justice Mambalima came to our house, the chairperson of the Zambian Electoral Commission, and she was there the morning of the counting of the ballots in the United States for a party to celebrate the results of the election, no matter what the results were. She had just come from the United States, and she had been in the United States during the period of the debates. And in her talk to us, she said, you know, I think Zambia could benefit from a system with more interaction by the candidates directly with the people so they can get more information through something like the debates. So I think that's an area where that was a strong point in our electoral process.
And there's this system of parties, whether you're winning or losing. In the States, people usually have parties just before the elections are announced.
You know,
I was in the States in 2008, and I was invited to one of the parties even before the results were announced.
Yeah, I think we celebrate democracy. I'm not going to tell you for whom I voted. I'm going to keep that secret and private. But whoever won this election, I feel great if I feel the American people had the opportunity to express themselves at the ballot box and we have a peaceful result. This election reinforced the strength of our democracy. And that's a great thing. All Americans support that.
You've been on the continent for a while now. What do you think are the major challenges? I mean, you said Zambia, well, Zambia is leading, but there are other countries on the continent who are unable to have a full-fledged democracy.
Absolutely.
What are the challenges? Would you highlight some of them?
Cravazio, the speech given by President Obama when he visited Ghana in Accra, for me, remains one of the best statements of how the United States views democracy in Africa. He said something very simple, but really good. He said that Africa does not need more strong men, it needs more strong institutions. What does that really mean? What that means is you don't want to have a democracy that's based just on a person. Because if it is, then it's subject to the vagaries of that person's personality, or something happens to that person. You want institutions that will support the democracy through time. And those institutions are ones we all know. They include things like a strong electoral commission, which you have here. They include a commitment to freedom of speech and a press that is independent and is able to express itself and convey information to the people. And civil society plays a very strong role. In our country, for this set of elections, civil society was the fact checker on all those debates, because people made all sorts of statements in the course of the debates. And then civil society would come up and say, you know, this was true, this wasn't true, this one is only partially true. That really helps the American people understand. Here in Zambia, civil society played a very important role in observing the elections and ensuring that they were done in a very transparent way. So I think that the really solid lesson is that in all of Africa, there has to be an increased emphasis on building those institutions that ensure democracy will be successful.
What do you think the role should be for the media? Well, of course, I saw that the media played a very critical role in the U.S. elections.
I think the media played a critical role in the elections here, too. The role of the media is first to be independent, not to be subject to direct government influence and directed to do this or that. The media have to try to find the information and present it to the people in an unbiased way. And I think the media also have to make the government accountable. The media needs to do investigations about what's going on. Did people live up to their promises? Tell the people whether or not government is doing what the people wanted their government to do. So media has a big role, and I want to say something about institutions and democracy and the media. Democracy in many respects is a series of habits. It's not something you can just do overnight. You really have to learn, okay, how do I report a story? What kinds of questions should I ask if you're in the media? How do I ensure that I'm not just accepting information that's given to me, but actually checking the facts? That requires training. It actually requires people going to school. It requires mentorship. The really successful and strong elements and leaders in the media, teaching those younger reporters who come forward, how do you do a story? How do you make sure you're presenting something in an objective way? So there's a lot of work, and it's an ongoing process.
Yep. Currently, while we're still on the issue of institutions, Zambia is undertaking a constitutional reforms. Are you supporting the process in any way?
Yes, we are.
Materially, financially?
Yes, we are. Very early on after your elections, I received a letter, as did all of the chiefs of mission of the diplomatic missions here, from His Excellency President Sata, expressing the commitment of the government to pursue constitutional reform and requesting our assistance, including financial assistance. And we went back to Washington. Washington, I think, was very enthusiastic after your elections and felt that you folks had done a really good job and deserve support. And so, in fact, we have put forward $1.26 million to support your constitutional reform process. And part of that is supposed to go through UNDP to support the technical committee. Part of it will try to help parliamentarians and their role, and part of it is going to focus on all the aspects of civil society and making sure that Zambians, and especially young people, can understand the process of their constitutional reform.
Let's take it at a broader level. Do you think, in your view, it's possible for Africa to have constitutions that are really people-driven?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I would say without doubt.
What should be done?
Well, first, I think Africans should take credit for what's gone right in this continent. There is a trend towards stronger and stronger democracies here in Africa. Zambia is one of the leaders, but it's not the only one. In the region, I think Botswana has a great democracy. We've seen things happening all around the continent where the leadership of the country has to respond to the will of the people. That's the most fundamental thing. Government of the people, by the people, for the people. That's a very simple statement of what democracy is all about. When this happens and you have an opportunity, as is going on right now, for the people to interact with their government on things like constitutional reform, they have an opportunity to express themselves. I was in Luapula province, and I was there mostly working on economic development issues and health issues. But it happened that at the hotel I was staying at on Lake Bangwayulu, in the morning I woke up and I saw a sign-up, conference here today on Constitution. I had no idea. I walked in, and there were representatives of local society, representatives of the government, representatives of the technical committee working on the Constitution, holding a consultation with the people on your constitutional reform process. I think that's a great way to go. I think that that's very important. And I didn't attend it, but I had an opportunity to look through some of the suggestions that were made by civil society and different groups. I was impressed. They were very specific kinds of suggestions about how the draft constitution might be made better. So that kind of consultation, I think, is extremely important. Consultation between the people and their government so that the information can flow back and forth.
Let's get back to your elections. The issue of the running mate has worked so well with the state. Do you think this is something Zambia could adopt?
You know, I think that is something for Zambia to decide. I don't think the United States should stick our nose into something like that. That's a question of how you put together your governing process. I note that we are very close with our allies, the British. They don't have a presidential system, they have a parliamentary system. They have a king or a queen right now. We would never have anything like that. There are many different ways to conduct a democratic system. And countries have got to look at fundamental principles like human rights, like independence of the media, like the role of civil society, and try to protect those, and then develop a constitution that grows out of their own national experience, that responds to what their own people want. So I don't think everyone has to have the same constitution.
Well, that brings me to the point of people have this talk that the States always wants its type of democracy planted where it is giving aid.
Let me say very, very
You don't accept any other democracy apart from democracy made in the States?
I don't think that's so. I'll say it very flatly. I've worked in 9 or 10 countries overseas. I've been stationed in countries in Asia, the Middle East, Africa, Europe, and democracies differ. And the United States does not try to insist on very specifically following the American model. And I want to be very clear about that. We don't do that at all. But what we do try to do is support fundamental principles of democracy. And we're not ashamed of it. We're proud of it. And I think that people around the world appreciate that fact. I think people here in Zambia appreciate that fact. So I guess I would have to say that I can understand that some people may feel that way because we are a bigger voice. We're more active on these issues. We probably care about democracy and human rights as much as any other country.
And you've got the money.
Well,
wow.
You know, let me tell you, the United States assistance budget to Zambia this year is going to be, in fact, I can't give you the exact number because there's so many different programs to add up. It will be over $400 million. Over $400 million to assist Zambia. The amount we're spending on democracy and governance is $1.26 million. The vast majority of our funding is to support the health of the Zambian people, to support economic development for the Zambian people, and to promote education of young Zambians.
So 1.6 is close to half your budget will go towards democracy?
No, 1.26 million out of about 450 million. It's less than 1%.
Okay. Now, let's look at another issue. President Obama has been re-elected.
Yes.
And towards the end of his campaign, we heard him endorse same-sex marriage. There's fear that on the continent, particularly that the states may bulldoze its way and attach this to aid and impose it on
you know,
African countries.
this is an issue that was addressed very directly by the Obama administration and through the State Department by embassies all over the world. And what we said very clearly is that we do want our aid to support rights of all people, including LGBT people. So that includes lesbians and gay people and their rights. But we also said we are not going to condition our aid on those issues. So we will support those issues. We'll support human rights for all people, but we're not going to make that a condition for assistance.
Yeah, well, let's move to foreign policy. What does, in specific terms, what does the re-election of President Obama mean for Africa and for Zambia in particular?
Okay, first and foremost, I think it means continuity. And what that means is the kinds of policies we've been pursuing, we're going to continue to pursue. But I get a little bit more specific than that. In the last year, President Obama and his administration produced a new presidential policy directive on our policy specifically for sub-Saharan Africa. So during his administration, he wanted to lay out a clear game plan of how we want to proceed. There are some very fundamental tenets in that, and it's built on two big pillars. The first is to support democracy and good governance, including the fight against corruption all over Africa. And the second is to promote economic development, including through increased trade and investment. This is elaborated in that policy document in much more specificity, and the document's actually been published. So if someone wants to go online and type in Presidential Policy Directive Africa, they can call it up and see exactly what's there. What it means for us is that we're going to continue to support Zambia's democracy, and you have a strong democracy, but we'll continue to support this democracy. We're also going to emphasize more our efforts to support Zambia's prosperity and Zambia's economic growth. We are working very hard right now to support greater American trade and investment with Zambia. You remember we had the AGOA Forum. Since the AGOA Forum, we've doubled bilateral trade between the United States and Zambia. In just 1 year, we've doubled bilateral trade. I want to double it again this year, and I want to double it again the year after that, if we can. We are taking specific steps to convince American businesses that this is a great place to invest.
So let me hold you on two issues there. You've raised an issue of corruption and another issue on economic policy. You've referred to AGOA. With regards to AGOA, there are a lot of specific hiccups that developing countries are facing, including Zambia: lack of marketing strategies, lack of production capacity. Do you have any specific interventions to address those?
Well, the first thing that's most important is that the Obama administration has committed itself to continuing the AGOA conditions, which are favorable to African states that show strong democratic tendencies, including Zambia. So that is going to continue. Second, we are working to try to find greater access for Zambian products to the American market. I don't know if you know Sylvia Banda. She is the head of Africa's AWEP efforts, the African Women's Entrepreneurship Program. She met with Secretary Clinton when Secretary Clinton visited. And just recently I saw her, and she was excited because she's been working very hard to gain access to the American market for some Zambian agricultural products that had been barred before for technical reasons. And she succeeded. So that's a success story. And we want to build more success stories like that. I would love to be able to go back to the United States and go to a supermarket and see products made in Zambia that are advertised as products made in Zambia, and that they're attractive because they come specifically from Zambia.
But you have a lot of stringent measures, particularly on vegetables.
Yes.
Sometimes it will take you 18 months to just get the pest risk assessment approved.
I want to make very clear, I don't deny it's difficult. There are reasons why we have these standards, and I think it's important to understand these standards are not just for imports. They apply to all the products made in the United States too. So what has happened is, over the years, we've developed a very strong effort to protect the health of the American people through standards for things like hygiene and purity of products. it's sometimes hard for African companies to demonstrate to the American regulators that they meet those standards. And sometimes it's just technology. Sometimes it's information. What we're going to do is try to find ways to get that technology and information to be available so we can have some more breakthroughs like the one we just saw.
Any specific funding to those areas? Leaving the market open is one way, one thing, but having to allow these people to go in, reducing well, not necessarily reducing the bar, but helping them to meet those standards.
Help them to meet the bar.
There should be a specific intervention to it. Yeah.
I think there should be. I think they should come in two areas. The first area is technical assistance to build capacity. We need to bring more officials from the U.S. government here who can help explain to Zambian businesses what is it they need to do to meet these standards. But I think that's only part of it. I think a bigger part, and the part that will be more effective in the long term, is to develop more and more partnerships between American businesses and Zambian businesses, because those American businesses already know how to meet the standards, and they can strengthen their Zambian partners so they can then have access to the market.
Well, still on the economy, China's come out more assertive than the US, and well, for obvious reasons. Do you feel, maybe I should ask you that, how do you feel that successive governments have aligned themselves to China, not the US?
I don't feel that governments align themselves with China necessarily. I don't think that's what's actually happening. I think that what's happening is that countries in Africa and people in Africa want investment and they want trade. And if that investment comes from China, they're glad to have it. If it comes from the United States, they're glad to have it. I don't think the United States should begrudge African countries, including Zambia, for accepting investment from other countries, including China. I actually think it's a good thing. And so we shouldn't look at this as that kind of a competition. What I really think we need to do are a couple of things. One is it's important that investment, wherever it comes from, and trade, whichever way it's going, is done in a way that's fair, that respects labor rights, that opposes corruption. Those are the things I think Zambians really care about. They want to make sure that their people are being treated fairly. And so I think that's something we can all try to work toward. I think we also need to fight corruption in all cases. It's never a good thing for a country to make trade deals based on some kind of a corrupt practice. And your government's working very hard against corruption right now. So I think that's very positive. That's one piece. But the other piece is I think the United States, frankly, needs to do more. Africa is growing now. Africa is being a success story, and that's a wonderful thing. 6 of the 10 fastest growing economies in the world this year are in Africa, in sub-Saharan Africa. Zambia's one of them. I've spoken with American businesses. I speak with them all the time. And I see big businesses like General Electric. I met with the CEO of General Electric. That's a company that has its own GDP that is 3 times the size of Zambia's. Huge company. And they said, we want to pay more attention to Africa because we see this is an area where growth is going to happen in the future. So that's exactly what we need to see. And I really want to encourage American businesses not to compete with China, but to be better partners with Africa and to share in what I think is going to be a very bright future here.
Are there any major reasons why we don't see so many American investors coming to Zambia as opposed to Chinese investors?
Yeah. Gravazio, I ask myself that question all the time. I really do.
You've interacted with your
I do, and I ask them that too. And I'll tell you what happens. Part of it is that the American market is so big that to a degree, American companies are focused overwhelmingly on the American market. That's one of the issues that's happened. Second, I think that in the past, and I don't think this is the case so much now, but in the past, Africa was viewed in the United States as a place that was unstable, where there were wars going on, where there wasn't much money, there weren't good opportunities for investment, and where you might face corruption, which Americans, we have laws in the United States. If you corrupt a Zambian official, you will go to jail in the United States. And that's called the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. I think that scared a lot of American companies away from investing in Africa. Part of that was ignorance, I think. Part of it was they weren't paying attention to what was really going on here. And things have changed. Things have changed for the better in most cases here in Africa, and definitely here in Zambia. And to me, that means that they need to catch up now. So I think they had some bad impressions. Some of them were right, but they're no longer as appropriate. They're certainly not appropriate for Zambia. And so I think if you show American companies and American investors what's really going on here, which we are doing, they will be interested. And in November, we're going to have a trade and investment delegation coming from the United States. It's led by the Department of Commerce. And it is the first two-country trade delegation sent to Africa ever. Obviously, when they thought about which countries they wanted to come to, they said, well, we should go to South Africa. It's the biggest economy by far. They looked at all the other countries, and they decided on Zambia. I'm very proud of that. I think it's wonderful. I think it shows confidence in your economy. It shows confidence in your stability. It shows confidence in your democracy. And it really shows that people think Zambia is a place where the economy is going to pick up in the future. So in November, we're going to have some very big companies.
Any projections of how much investment we expect from the States now that there is a reawakening, like you say, they're more enlightened?
Well, let me start with this. There's a lot of money in the United States, and a lot of companies have built up money and are trying to look now for places to invest it. The so-called Eurobond that was just sold, this was the Zambian sovereign bond that was sold in the international financial markets. It's called a Eurobond for reasons that are technical, but it was sold in New York. It was denominated in dollars, and 56% of the investors were American. It's already happening. So of that $750 million bond, over half was American. So that's an investment already. I don't want to put a particular figure on this because these decisions are made individually. You know, our government does not control our businesses, and we don't tell them, you must invest a certain amount. That's not the way it works. Our businesses come and they look for opportunities individually. They look for partners. They'll look for Zambian partners with whom they can make some progress. And then they'll cut individual deals. And when it's over, we'll look and see what it is. Some of this will take time. I want to be very clear about this. They won't come and say, okay, here's $1 billion. That's not the way it works. They'll come, they'll make partnerships, they'll meet people, they'll talk with government officials, and then they'll start planning. And we'll see the deals rolling out over time.
Well, we're still on this China, American. China's well known for investing in big infrastructure projects, roads, bridges, stadia. Well, the States is more into technical issues. And there's talk that much of the money that gets in still gets out on your expertise.
Well, I think that one of the things that's happening right now in Africa is that African countries, as they become wealthier, as Zambia is, they're trying to look for quality for money. They want to have investments that will last. They're now saying, gee, we need world-class technology. We don't need second-class technology. And so I think American technology, including for infrastructure, is increasingly attractive for African countries. And I think that I'm expecting that even here in Zambia, when the government and when private enterprises here are looking for big investments, they're going to be more interested in American technology because they know it's the best.
Let's get back to the issue of money getting out from here, going back to pay your workers. Is much of the aid you give aim to create employment for Americans and Zambians?
Let me answer that in a couple of ways. First, you're aware of the Millennium Challenge account compact that we signed back in May between the United States and Zambia. It's a $354.8 million investment by the United States government in Zambia, specifically in Lusaka water, drainage, and sanitation. This is something that's really needed here in Zambia. Everybody in Lusaka knows this. They know if you're in one of the compounds, the water doesn't work. It's not clean. Your children get sick. You lose days from work. They lose days from school. This is having a big negative impact on Zambia's economic development. We're making that investment. It's a huge investment. Do you know how many Americans we brought here to manage it? $354 million? Two Americans. All of this is going to be managed by Zambians. And when when American companies come here and they invest, they want to employ Zambian employees. One of the reasons is simply economic. It costs much more to employ an American than it does to employ a Zambian. So I think what you'll find is that American companies are much better at employing Zambians and creating opportunities in Zambians than many other countries. And they do it because they think it's the right thing to do, but they do it also because it makes economic sense.
Held in 2 points. There was the economic bit and the corruption point bit where you said you're going to invest more in trying to fight. How do you think, how big is the scourge on the continent, corruption?
Well, let me say first that corruption exists everywhere. It does not exist. It's not an African problem or an Asian problem or an American problem. If you visit America's prisons, you will find former governors and former congressmen in those prisons because they were corrupt. So I want to make very clear, this is a problem of humanity. It's not a problem of any one country or any place. I think that a lot of this gets back to institutions. If you don't have institutions in place that can conduct the investigations, that can do proper prosecutions, that can make the process of the purchase of, say, roads transparent so that people can see actually what's happening, then corruption will take place. And it will happen anywhere, either the United States or here. So I think it's a very good thing that Zambia is investing, for instance, increasing the budget for the Anti-Corruption Commission. You have to do that if you want to have institutions that are capable of fighting corruption. And you can see right now that the government is pursuing a number of investigations. That will help. It sends a signal, and the signal it's sending is, you know what, we don't want corruption in our country. So the problem, I think, in the past, Cravazio, here in Africa, has been that the institutions are weak. I don't think humans are fundamentally different anywhere. And so what we're seeing now is a strengthening of institutions in Africa, and definitely here in Zambia, to fight corruption. That's going to have a positive impact.
What is your assessment? Is Africa and Zambia in particular winning the war against corruption?
I would say that this is a war that's permanent. It's not something that you win or lose. We're still fighting it in the United States. And I think that Zambia is definitely making progress right now in fighting corruption. I think that's a positive thing. So I wouldn't look at it. I don't think this is one of those things that you have to think of as where you win the war or lose the war. I guess it's something like trying not to gain weight. I don't know about you, but when I go home tonight, I'm going to open the refrigerator and there's going to be a piece of cake in there. I've already thought about that piece of cake, and there's going to be an apple, and I'm going to have to choose. That happens every night. And I think that corruption's the same way. People have got to, each day, get up and say, okay, how do we strengthen our institutions? How do we make the right choices?
Now, let's get back to specifics about Barack Obama's. People are skeptical about. He only made one visit to sub-Saharan Africa, and that was just about 24 hours. Do we expect change from the support?
Well, I'll say a couple of things about that, Cravazio. One is you shouldn't look at the number of visits as directly equal to the importance that's given to something. Actually, President Obama's policies have been very good for Africa. And they've been very positive in terms of strong support for AGOA, in terms of continuing to support American investment, private investment, and in terms of the big initiatives and assistance, global health, which Zambia has really benefited from, efforts called Feed the Future to support agricultural income, and I think that's going to help Zambia a lot, and I think we have a strong partnership on this issue developing, and fighting the problems of climate change. Those are all good for Africa. Even though President Obama has not visited so much, I think you know that Secretary Clinton has been all over Africa, including right here in Zambia, where she spent 3 days here. We've had a whole parade of high-level visitors from the United States, from our Senate, from the executive branch, in trade, businesses. So I think there's a lot of positive momentum. I do think, and I'll say very frankly, and this is not something I know, but something that I feel, President Obama came into office at a time when the United States was facing a grave recession. That was a big problem. He came into office at a time when we had 2 active wars going on. And so I think he had to dedicate an awful lot of energy to dealing with those issues. He's made a lot of progress on those issues. So I'm hopeful, in fact, that there might be some increased emphasis on Africa.
No.
And the Presidential Policy Directive is a good indication of that. And that was done already months ago.
The landscape hasn't changed much.
What do you mean?
Unemployment rate is still high in the States. There's
Well,
still the Syrian war to deal with. There's still Afghanistan to wind down.
the world's a complicated place. There are a lot of things to deal with. But when President Obama came into office, the U.S. economy was losing 800,000 jobs per month. 800,000 jobs. Nearly 1 million people are losing their job every month. For the past 34 months, they've increased the number of private sector jobs every month. It hasn't been as much as we would like, but it's definitely, as I like to say, the trend is our friend. And as regards foreign policy is always a challenge. There are always events that you can't predict, that you have to deal with. And the President of the United States, probably more than anybody else, has to pay a lot of attention. I guess the President and the Secretary General of the United Nations are probably the two people who have the most global view of issues. But you can see the trend. You can see what President Obama is trying to do. He's trying to end wars, not start wars. And he's trying to find ways to focus on economic development, not just at home, but overseas as well.
Now let's get back to the policy statements. You've talked about governance and the economy. Any other issues that states is really focusing on in terms of assisting?
Yes. That policy statement also talks about security on the continent. I think that we learned that, it was a hard lesson, but we've learned it, that problems in security that happen anywhere in the world ultimately can affect any other place in the world. That was one of the lessons of September 11th. It certainly was one of the lessons of what happened in the attacks on our embassies in countries nearby. So it includes an effort to focus on strengthening stability and security in Africa, with a particular emphasis on strengthening those regional security organizations in Africa that are already playing a positive role, like the AU, like SADC. As you know, Zambia itself has played a role in peacekeeping here in Africa. And I'm very pleased that the Zambian government has come back to us and said, you know, if there's an opportunity for training related to peacekeeping, we'd be interested in that. And we're trying to find ways to strengthen these institutions so that Africans themselves are better placed to be able to deal with security problems on the continent themselves.
You bring me to the issue of security. There are issues of insecurity in Mali. Is the states likely to give any support to that? Well,
you know, I think that we are concerned about what's happened in Mali, and we're following it closely. I think one of the things that we've seen there, this is just what I was referring to before, there's always a danger, if there's instability in a country, that someone will try to take advantage of it one way or another, even to export that instability. And so I think it's important for us to try to find ways to calm the situation down and to produce you know, the positive reinforcement of peace.
Well, you're not moving there because you don't have so much interest in it.
You know, I don't think that's the right way to view such cases. It's very important, and I've been working in foreign affairs now for almost 30 years, it's very important to look at every country and every situation based on what it is. It's a big mistake to try to have one model and use it everywhere. That doesn't provide the best result. So I think, you know, we will look at how we can support peace and stability in Mali, and it's not going to be the same as it would be, say, in Syria. It'll be different.
How do you hope Obama will help harmonize, will try to harmonize relations with the AU? There was a big rift when it came to handling Libya.
Let me start.
Gaddafi.
Yeah, let me start by saying that the United States really is paying ever more attention to the African Union, and the reason is because the AU is ever more important. And that's partly because Africa is more important, I think, but also it's because those institutions themselves are getting stronger. So, for instance, Secretary Clinton attended the last AU summit, and we are trying to strengthen our relations with the African Union, including in security issues, for instance, in how to enhance Africa's own capabilities. for things like peacekeeping, for things like communication amongst African countries, not with the United States, but with one another. So if there's a crisis, they can communicate with one another easily to try to help solve the crisis. I think that's the kind of direction that we're going to try to go in.
Well, as we wind down the interview, we could also look at Syria. There's also a difference there in terms of perception. The United States and NATO want regime change, and the other side want a political solution to that crisis. Do we see any amicable resolution, a midway solution to that?
You know, I think that, and it's common to do this, one can focus on differences, and there are certainly differences amongst countries in how to approach different subjects. But there are also areas where we actually agree. And I think an area that we all agree is that what's going on in Syria right now is terrible, that a lot of civilians are being killed and hurt, that refugees are being generated and flowing out into other countries. And so I think the U.S. approach to the situation in Syria is fundamentally in favor of human rights and fundamentally in favor of democracy, favoring a situation where the people get to govern themselves rather than having a dictator tell them how their lives are going to go. So I think there's more common ground than you might imagine there, and I don't think that you've seen any actions by the United States that